The First World War brought honors and glories unto many, but for tens of millions at that time it meant nothing but death and disability. A generation returned from the front lines to find their homes in ruin and in famine, and their own condition tenfold worse, and with a future all the more bleak in vision, and as it turned out, so in realization. It is little matter of debate that the Great War was the turning point of modernity. Its aftermath single-handedly paved the course for perhaps the one war more devastating than it, as well as for the dethroning of the European from the world throne, and the most radical upturning of any culture in all of history. In its bringing about the rise of fascism, of communism, of atheism, and of unspeakable casualty and genocide, it is hard for any moral heart to not detest the very idea of the war, and for any good heart to wish it to never have happened. Yet any reasonable and modernly attuned mind must recognize it as necessary in bringing down the evils of racism, of sexism, of imperialism, and of a countless number of harmful ideologies, and forming the good we hold dear in the world today, at least generally. In recognition of those two facts, both the evil of the war's excess and the good of its instance, let us today suppose a more moderate course of the war, to bring about the good it brought, with a little less of the evil in kind. The crux of the misery of the war is its length, and there's no obvious fix for that. Even if we wanted to suppose a German victory and set the Germans marching on Paris in the first year of the war, it would be totally mistaken to assume of the French ethos at the time an immediate surrender. Verily, the French had not only enough will but also spite to fight on should Paris fall before 1916, or perhaps even 1917. So that's a dead end from the get-go. Rather, we need to suppose the Germans to surrender in a rather timely manner. That, of course, is not a simple supposition in any regard, but we must also take into account these few facts. Should the Americans never have time to get involved, President Wilson would have in no way enough legitimacy to suppose his 14 points through in any capacity whatsoever, and the peace treaty would be far too harsh on the Germans, which, yes, might prevent the Second World War, but would realistically sow the seeds for even further far-right radicalization and ideology to arise, and would probably not allow for the same level of liberalization in the latter half of the century as in our world, which we are after all trying to suppose. Additionally, should the Russians collapse in the East, communism would still plague the world for nearly a century, and bring about millions of innocent deaths within Eurasia and the world as a whole. So let's do everything in our power to stack the odds against the Germans, keep Russia in the war, bring America into it earlier, and have it end by middle 1917 at the latest. First, to keep Russia in the war, as the path for this must be begun rather early on. Namely, early 20th century Russia, under the leadership of Nicholas II, was an uncompromising, unreforming autocracy, which thus was unprepared for modern war and always ready for revolution should things go awry. Worse yet, Nicholas II took direct control of the military efforts in 1915, intertwining himself personally to the failures of the military and giving further catalyst to the revolution 2 years later. The simplest way to dig Russia out of this mess is a hint of unrealism, namely supposing that Tsar Nicholas isn't totally dead set on the whole autocracy thing, but rather leans into liberalism, just as his grandfather half a century ago before him did. All in all, it isn't a totally ridiculous supposition. Nicholas grew very fond of British constitutionalism in his early adulthood when he visited the United Kingdom. But ultimately the assassination of his father and his stunted personality led him down to reactionarism. Anyhow, this video isn't about Russia, so we'll simply say that the revolution of 1905, after the disastrous campaign in Japan, turns Russia into a more constitutional monarchy, and ultimately the Tsar more popular with the moderates of all sorts and with the liberals. Over the next decade, Russia undergoes major agricultural reforms and very light but significant industrialization. Next, critically, we'll say Nicholas never steps to the front lines in 1915, but leaves the command of the military to far more competent men, and stays in Petrograd to handle the domestic issues of Russia. For our next ridiculous supposition come the start of the war proper in 1914. Let us say the British are far more paranoid of German naval prowess, and thus elect to go for the close blockade plan proposed by Admiral Arthur Wilson, rather than the distant blockade, which they went for in our timeline. In short, British vessels are stationed only a ways away from German ports in the Baltic and North Seas, instead of on the edges of the latter. This does nothing major in terms of German counter-strategy. It's still simply unrestricted submarine warfare, but only to a greater degree, as the continuation of the German war effort seems more and more uncertain as time goes on, and the public grows ever more restless. Ultimately, the close blockade plan included eventual plans of naval landing in Pomerania, but realistically the very threat of such an invasion would necessitate a diversion of some German troops to stand by near the coasts in case of it, effectively eliminating any possibility of the Entente engaging in such a dangerous operation. More honestly, the Great War probably spills over into Denmark, the continental part of which the Germans occupy, and the islands which are readily enforced by the Entente. The greater effect of the blockade is in necessitating a continuation of the German doctrine of unrestricted naval warfare. In our timeline, the program was begun in 1915 but shortly discontinued after the sinking of the Lusitania, due to threats from America of intervention, only to be restarted in 1917 and ultimately leading to the Americans joining into the war anyway. Here we shall say the Germans are more desperate, far more desperate, and elect to, against all odds, continue the program, leading to the Americans joining the war in early 1916, arriving to the European front lines by May or June of the same year. Meanwhile, on the other fronts, we should suppose a myriad different smaller changes. Perhaps we don't need to, but let's do so for fun. Firstly, to screw Austria over, let us suppose the Serbian war effort never collapses, mainly by supposing the Bulgarians don't join the Central Powers, but instead the Entente. It isn't all that easy of a thing to imagine, but perhaps with strengthened Bulgarian-Russian ties, as well as Entente promises of the Bulgarians being awarded Macedonian and Dobrujan lands in post-war treaties, the Bulgarians agree to join the winning side. The Bulgarians joining the Entente also cuts off the Ottomans from the rest of the Central Powers, and paves the way to the Bosporus Straits and to supplying Russia through the Black Sea. Almost needless to say, but with Bulgaria on the Entente side, the Gallipoli campaign can be considered a difficult, but ultimately successful campaign, which ultimately sees the Ottomans surrender by the middle of 1916. Returning to Germany, come about early spring of 1917. The war situation is bleak. The last year has seen nothing but German defeats on the Western Front, which has slowly been advancing away from France proper, and is nearing Belgium and Germany even. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front has fully stabilized for the better part of a year with no end in sight, and with what little German advance there has been having been most costly. Worse yet, the Austrians are being pushed back on nearly all sides, and famine is hitting the nation hard. With no hope in sight, Germany is forced to surrender, and here truly by the Kaiser's hand rather than the OHL. Wilhelm probably never abdicates the throne under these circumstances, but rather is forced to acquiesce everything but the name of his power to the democratic system. Anyhow, peacetime. Versailles happens, but rather moderately. There's no actual saving of many of the principles the Americans set forth, but some of them will be followed, rather by necessity. Realistically, America's reach doesn't extend far enough to influence the course of the Middle East in any particularly fruitful way, but probably rather the rest of the Entente's visions are seen through in their entirety there. Namely, the Treaty of Sèvres is ultimately enforced, as Russia is there to secure quelling Turkish independence resistance. In addition to the Middle East of our timeline, the French, the Italians and the Greeks split much of the Anatolian coast of the Mediterranean. Furthermore, in the east of Turkey proper, the greater region of Armenia is awarded to the Russians, and Kurdistan is given independence, even if under the watchful European eye. In the Straits, much that which is left of Turkey in Europe proper, in Thrace, is awarded to the Bulgarians, while the Straits become an international zone. Lastly, the Ottomans are further weakened by huge swaths of their remaining land being under European economic and military influence. As for Austria-Hungary, I can't see it going very different at all. The bits of Galicia which fell to the Polish now fall to Russia and Poland under Russian rule. Speaking of Poland, the Russians are forced to acquiesce to some sort of greater independence for the nation. But naturally the Russians don't let the nation get too far from their grasp. Finally, Germany. Again, there are no major changes here. The nation certainly isn't dissolved or anything of the sort. But there are some noteworthy changes anyway. For one, the Polish corridor is never realized. With Poland allied or under Russia anyway, what's the need after all? Rather, the border is adjusted more in line with the populous distribution at the time, slightly favoring Poland. As for Denmark, it hardly gets anything. Probably the Schleswig portion of Schleswig-Holstein is awarded to it, and other than that, nothing changes. The Germans are forced to demilitarize the Rhineland and return Alsace-Lorraine to the French, and cede Eupen Malmedy to Belgium, and of course forfeit all of their colonies. By late 1919, Europe, all of Europe, is truly at peace. Anyhow, the 20s sees the rapid growth of the world economy from the stagnation of the decade's beginning, and to a greater scale than in our timeline, since Europe is less devastated as a whole from the shorter war, and its due destruction and famine. And since the Europeans are in far less debt to the Americans, again due to the shorter war, their total debt being perhaps some 5 billion USD rather than the excess of 10 billion in our timeline. All in all, these changes from our timeline cause Europe to be less dependent on America, and the cycle of loans through America, Germany, the Entente and America again, which amounted to a huge part of the paid debts in Europe, is far less than in our timeline. The interwar period never sees the rise of far-right ideology to the levels of our timeline. The fascists never march on Rome to coup the government fully, but undoubtedly the fascists and other right-wing parties would have massive influence in a more democratic Italian kingdom from the middle of the 20s forward. In Germany, no stab in the back myth ever takes precedence, as it was very the establishment who lost the war, since the Kaiser signed the peace. The general misery of the interwar would see the rise of communism and of staunchly anti-monarchist fascism in Germany, and come the stock market crash of 1929, the fascists would take over, dethroning old Wilhelm. Speaking of the stock market crash, it happens just as it did in our timeline, with the bursting of the overinflated speculatory economic bubble. Its effects sure rippled through the world, causing the Great Depression. But all in all, with Europe less reliant on America, the scale of devastation, for Europe anyway, is far lesser. In around the years following the dawn of the Great Depression, fascist Germany and rightist Italy align with one another, and begin to expand their spheres of influence across Europe and Africa. Just as in our timeline, Italy asserts its dominion over Albania and Ethiopia, and equally poorly in so. Germany, for its part, manages to sway the European powers to relinquishing the annexation of Austria, be it out of pity, shame or whatever. At around the same time, France and Russia begin to remilitarize in case of another war. Over a period of 5 or 6 years after that, the Axis alliance expands to include Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, whose non-Czechoslovak lands are robbed of them, and who are generally coerced into Axis cooperation, as well as the Ottoman Sultanate. All the while, Serbia, Bulgaria and Greece are driven to increased mutual cooperation and alliance with Russia. Japan too signs an alliance with the Axis, an imitation of the Tripartite Pact. Speaking of Japan, it is hardly doing so hot in China, with the Russians there to contest them in their conquest of Manchuria. Nevertheless, Japanese aims remain the very same as in our timeline. Whatever precisely happens, it's obvious that a second Great War will erupt in time. However and whenever it does happen, it will result in an Axis loss in a matter of years. To give some semblance of a timeline though, let us suppose the war begins with the Germans demanding the restoration of the 1914 borders in Poland, to which the Polish and the Russians say no, prompting Axis invasion. In contrast to our timeline, the war blossoms to put the entire Axis against France and Russia, that is, including Japan against them. With France's strengthened footing and the threat which is Russia, Britain probably steps back from the Entente during the interwar period, paralleling the America of our timeline. Here America retires from world politics completely, focusing on true splendid isolation and the Monroe Doctrine. The Axis powers have some early successes in the war, conquering the Entente Balkan and Poland rather swiftly. But the advance in France and Russia proper is more difficult, something more akin to the First World War. In essence, this boils down to the fascists in Germany being less cooperative with the old guard, who failed Germany in the First War, and purging them, replacing them with generally less competent fascist generals. In East Asia, Japan manages to bring China fully into the war whilst fighting Russia in Manchuria, and the fractured nation joins the Entente proper. In a vital contrast to our timeline though, Japan doesn't seem like that much of a threat to the Americans. So little embargo is placed upon them, and Japan never needs to directly invade the Philippines or the East Indies. In addition, Britain is not totally reluctant to trade with the Axis power either, as the impact of the Anglo-Japanese alliance still shines to the day, and as the Brits too are far more wary of the Russian threat than the Japanese one. Be as all may, the turning point of the war in favor of the Entente comes truly only after Paris falls, at which point the French don't surrender and the Brits join the fray, acting as the America of this timeline. Over the next 2 or 3 years, first the Italians and Ottomans are beaten back, then finally the Germans, and peace ensues. It is vital to note that no Axis power is ideologically delusional enough to enact a Holocaust, let alone is there the time or the absolute control over the European Jewry to enact it. So no great civilian genocide happens during the Second Great War. Rather than the total annihilation of the concept of a German nation post-war, as happened in our timeline, Germany is divided between the various victorious powers, probably into the nations of Hanover, Rhineland, and Bavaria in the west, and Prussia in the east. An invisible curtain falls across the face of Europe, though it is rather just fabric than iron. In the west, you have the Anglo-French bloc, England on the world stage and France on the European, and in the east you have the Russian bloc, dominating much of Eurasia. To ensure no great war happens again, the United Nations is established, much as in our timeline, though perhaps America stays out of it. A Cold War of sorts begins, but not one dominated by constant fears of world destruction, but one of cultural competition, a friendly enough rivalry to see which culture is superior, the Eastern and more conservative one, or the Western and more liberal one. The latter half of the century sees a radical deterioration of the prevailing world order, as the populations of Asia and Africa begin to grow, and as the Western cultures begin to reach their natural liberal limit. Decolonization becomes the ruling precedent in imperialist policy. Of course, the whole notion of imperialism as disgusting and comparable to Nazism doesn't exist here, so that trend toward international egalitarianism doesn't develop quite as quickly. The whole process conceivably starts on any major scale a little bit earlier, with its bulk being around the 70s and 80s, though Egypt and Algeria, for example, might gain their total sovereignty by as early as the 50s. The last remnants of the early imperial era would be in Angola and Mozambique, as Portugal simply refuses to let go. As a general rule, I'd imagine early decolonization to arise from revolution, and later on decolonization from agreement. It's hard to talk of specifics, but I'd imagine the British established a version of the Commonwealth in the late 50s or early 60s, and its whole nature be a bit more reminiscent of proper imperialism. The French too would probably retain some sort of Commonwealth for their former colonies, though theirs would probably be more like the British one of our day in legality, with all the neo-colonialism of the French in effect. Nevertheless, the European powers barely hold any type of influence over Asia, as China is there to thwart European influence. Speaking of China, once the Second World War is all done and over, the Kuomintang, rather than the CCP, secures its power in the nation. In contrast to our timeline says there never was any communist Soviet Union to arise disdain amidst the more, well, undecided parts of the party. The Kuomintang becomes more left-wing, as moderately more right-wing elements don't align with it against the communist threat, and more socialist elements flock to it rather than the CCP. No segue here, but Russia faces its own difficulties over the 20th century. Obviously it does. The first half of the century is chiefly focused on industrialization and agricultural reform. At the start of the century, Russia was an agrarian state, but by its middle, it will be a true rival to the European powers, and equal even. Industrialization will be slower than in our timeline, without the forced industrialization of the Soviet 5-year plans. But altogether this timeline Russia catches up with our timeline Soviet Union by the 60s at the very latest, and begins to develop past it after that. Additionally, the agricultural sector will not be nearly as disregarded, so expect less famines and generally a more populous nation. By modernity, the population of Russia is perhaps upwards of 400 million people here. The latter half of the century boiling over to modernity will see the issue of multiculturalism truly surface in Russia. As the years progress, it will be increasingly hard for the ruling Russian population to exert its influence over the Baltic and Western Slavs, as well as over the Finns and the Turkics and other peoples. Probably by at the latest 2010s, Russia will have been forced to acquiesce to grant further autonomy to many of the minority peoples. And something akin to the Russian Federation of our day will be realized, but of course with the Romanovs at its head. Anyhow, after the Kuomintang secures China, the nation becomes rather the only socialist nation of this timeline, but nevertheless a democracy, which is at times a libertarian socialist state, and at others a social democracy. With Kuomintang leadership, China won't undergo all the devastation of the Maoist era, and the economy will rise to be a real competitor to the Europeans by the 80s at the latest. Predictably, as for what comes to technology, medicine will actually be a bit behind of our timeline. As detestable as it is, Nazi and Japanese human experiments did tell the world of medicine a lot about genetics and twins and whatnot. As for the space race, I don't fucking know, and I won't pretend to. On one hand, the main great powers of it, here Britain and Russia, are wealthier due to economic policy, continued imperialism and less devastation from the wars. But on another hand, there isn't as much drive to prove one ideology superior to another. Perhaps the space race is delayed by some 2 or 3 years in each of its achievements, but continues on longer, perhaps never even truly ending, with Britain reaching the moon first, then Russia, then France, and so forth. On a more general note regarding technology and society, single-payer universal healthcare is much rarer here than in our timeline. Naturally, some outliers still adapt the welfare state, China as mentioned, but also perhaps the Nordic countries, as Sweden, the chief proprietor of the Nordic model, never did face the horrors of war in our timeline, let alone here. So the causes for the socialistic transition can hardly be supposed to have changed in any way. Nevertheless, I doubt the model expands in any very significant way to Britain or France, let alone Catholic or Orthodox Europe. The lacking welfare state so in the West as in the East, though Soviet healthcare wasn't superb by any means, has the European life expectancy lowered on an average perhaps by some 5 years, and infant mortality is raised. Generally, not a good thing for an individual, but for a developed society it actually isn't the worst. Lowered life expectancy and increased infant mortality rate coincides, for obvious reasons, with increased birth rate and a more healthy child-adult-elder balance within a society, generally meaning a healthier workforce, in terms of economy anyway. Another factor raising the birth rate in Europe is increased faith in God. The general devastation of the world wars quite naturally destroyed the faith of many. After all, how could the good Christian God allow such utter tragedy and carnage, with the First World War being less disastrous, and the second one far less devastating, certainly with the lack of a Holocaust? The great atheist storm never strikes the European ethos. As a general note, Protestant Europe still undergoes slight societal secularization, but less than in our timeline. Catholic Europe a tinge less than Protestant Europe, and Orthodox Europe yet a bit less. By 2026 I'd imagine the least Christian Orthodox nations to have over 90% of the population identifying as Christian, while the least Catholic nations identifying some 70%, and at most some 100%. And the least Protestant nations identifying some 50% and at most some 90%. Of course, only some small majority of these percentages are actually practicing Christians, and yet a smaller percentage actually faithful Christians. Nevertheless, on an average by modernity, perhaps 30 or 40% of Europe is truly devoted Christians, as much as a layman can be anyway. The societal effects of a more religious society are more significant than birth rate, of course. However the social rights movement develops into the queer movement, it must do so under the watchful eye of Christian dogma. By no means will racism be a legal issue in modernity anyway. The shift towards decolonization ripples anti-racist sentiment to Europe, which is reinforced by Christian dogmatic notions of the equality of man. America works rather on its own here, but nevertheless the decolonial effect would echo to end Jim Crow and segregation eventually, even if probably some decades later than in our timeline. Again, this delay is because of the lack of fighting Nazi racism, which here doesn't work to show the hypocrisy of American racist society. The feminist movement began well over a century and a half ago, so the partly lacking devastation of the world wars won't have much effect on feminist agitation. In our timeline, the war effort necessitated extensive women's participation in the workforce, as men went off to fight the war. This fact is hardly lost in Europe proper here, though I suppose it is lost in America. Regardless, the second wave of feminism will sweep through Western Europe by at the latest the 60s, and probably the East by at the latest the 80s. As for what comes to third wave feminism, the apparent inequality which arises from the different roles of men and women in Christian society will be a matter of debate probably even to this very day, though some of the most liberal nations in Europe will have rather extensive legal protections for women to ensure egalitarianism in the workplace. In terms of religion, I doubt even the Lutheran world will allow female priests and or bishops. Okay, perhaps Sweden will. All in all, the gay movement will be the least successful of the greater social rights movement in this timeline. Few Western countries will legalize homosexuality. Some will accept it on a societal level, but many will outright detest the idea, and homosexuals will face either legal or vigilante reprimand. Without an accepted gay movement, the transgender or genderqueer movement will not take off at all. Gender dysphoria will be almost exclusively regarded as mere delusional transvestitism, except for in a few very given radical alt cultures. Anyhow, we are well past the use of chronology, and the unrelating time pressure of trying to have this video up by Sunday is also knocking. So, we look to modernity to a world rather akin to ours. Perhaps its visage is the rather fruition of the new conservative stream. The West is ways more religious than we know it. The world as a whole more populous, perhaps reaching the 9th billion man. And the national question is hardly, in any capacity, questioned or challenged. Regional unions such as the EU either aren't established or are more economic and or military unions than federative entities. And as a whole, national pride is a more prevalent quality in the world ethos. The popular man is blissfully unaware of the tragedies which could have been. Numerous genocides are prevented, tens of millions of ideological deaths are foregone, as well as the very invention of many of those ideologies. It is all, arguably, a better world. Well, alright, this whole video was rather doomed from the start, as it is based on what I'm guessing a modicum of people will agree is a good enough, better world to arise. Of course, there's also the issue that even discussing the very effects of a changed Great War should easily take upwards of 2 hours, which I simply cannot be bothered to do. Anyhow, this was something. What shall I end with? The unholy ones have you and keep you. Dies irae.